If you're like me and you've been wanting to cut how much plastic you're using in your garden, you're gonna wanna watch today's video. It is a winter wonderland outside. So I'm here in the barn and I am soaking wet from taking care of the sheep and doing all of the farm chores. And yet I promised that I would show you how we do our detailed soil blocking from start to finish using our new recipes here in 2024. All of the learnings that we made along the way. Today, we're doing that video because it's snowy outside. So in soil blocking, we are using our soil blocker and a tray, and that's pretty much the only equipment that you need, but we're gonna go through all those details here. Let's just hop into it. So there are several different soil blockers, and one of the top questions that I get is what size soil blocker should I get? Let's go over the sizes. So this one is the one I call the baby soil blocker. This one makes 20 mini blocks in one punch. So it's great for starting a lot of seeds, and it's also great for conserving space. So if you are short on space like I am, I have an 8x10 greenhouse and I start 14,000 seeds because I'm a market farmer. I'm starting a ton. If you're a home gardener, you might not need to start with these little tiny ones. There's a downside of all of this space saving, and that is that you have to keep watering these more frequently. So they dry out faster because they're smaller. Most people who have trouble soil blocking start with these, and therein lies the problem. They are finicky to make and they are finicky to keep moist. So not the one I recommend for most beginners. Again, if you're trying to save space and start a lot of seeds, the minis can be great. Other downside is that with the minis, you're going to need to also get this guy. This is the big soil blocker. This one makes 2-inch soil blocks, and you can see it makes 4 at one time. And you'll want this one to go along with this one because these ones are probably going to need potting up. So once these ones get big and they start to outgrow these blocks, you start to see them slow down in growth, and maybe all of the roots are starting to come out of the bottom and they've just kind of started to look a little bit sad. Then it's time to pot up into the bigger ones. So you'll need to get this one if you're going to get the little one. Get the giant 2-inch soil blocker, and you're gonna wanna get these pop-out inserts. So these little inserts are the exact same size as the blocks that come out of here. We'll show how you do this here in a second, but these two really should go together. So if you're going to get the mini blocker, get this set that comes with the mini blocker, the 2-inch blocker, and these little inserts, and then you'll be set up. But again, you're going to have to pot up for most things. I know that there are growers who just grow things in these minis, and actually we grow our Lysianthus all the way until it's time to transplant in these mini blocks, and we never pot up. But that's because Lysianthus are tiny seeds. They're little seedlings. They don't get very big. For most other things, I've just found that with experience that they do better in a slightly bigger block. So if you don't need a lot of space saving on your heat mats, if you're not starting thousands of seeds, these two might not be your best bet. Instead, for those folks, I recommend the medium, or the mama bear soil blocker, as I call it. And this one makes 1 3/4 inch blocks. So it's kind of the in-between size. Mine needs to be oiled. And you can see it comes with these little dibble inserts, which is really nice because that saves me from having to make little holes in all of my blocks to start my seeds in. So this one makes the medium-sized blocks, which I find is just the most friendly for most people. You're not gonna have to pot up out of it, and also they don't dry out as quickly. They also happen to be the easiest soil blocks to make, whereas the little ones can be a little bit finicky and the big ones can be a little bit finicky. This medium-sized one are the easiest to make. So let's mix up our soil and we're gonna talk through that. Now, if you're like me and you've been researching soil blocking, when I started out, I was really intimidated by all of these different mixes I was finding. Different ingredients, a lot of them have weird ingredients that I couldn't find at my garden center, things like rock phosphate and green sand. One of our more recent recipes used Coco Loco potting soil, coconut coir, and green sand. That one will still work, so if you still have all those ingredients, go ahead and use them up. But we've actually simplified it a little bit more this year. Now, you already know, probably if you're here, that we don't like to use peat in the garden. The harvest of peat itself is really unsustainable. It releases a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. Shipping it here is unsustainable. It takes a long time for peat bogs to regrow and to recreate those ecosystems. And actually, they're our largest carbon sequesterer on the planet, peat bogs are. So we want to leave those peat bogs alone. We don't need it for our gardening practices. Instead, we use a peat-free potting soil. Now, I always get questions about this potting soil. Why do you use Fox Farms? It's because it's one of the only peat-free potting soils I have found that's available to me. It's this one and a brand called Beyond Peat, and I didn't love that one. It didn't work very well. Fox Farms hasn't paid me a cent. There is no advertising here. They haven't sent me any free product. none of that. So this is just the one that I found that I've used that is consistent from batch to batch. And I like it because it's peat free. But if you don't have access to this product, don't let that hinder you. Find the best potting soil you can locally. If it's peat free, all the better, and use that. Here's how we're going to make this usable here's how we're going to make this soil usable for soil blocking. A lot of people don't like to use potting soil for soil blocking because it has some chunks in it, right? So it has some clumps and some chunks, and if we're making mini blocks, those can get stuck in there. When it's soil blocking time, we roll up our sleeves. So a lot of people don't like to use potting soil, but potting soil is so much better than seed starting soil. I'm just gonna say it. A lot of seed starting soil are sterile, devoid of nutrients. They have a lot of peat. Peat is really hard to moisten. Beyond the sustainability issue, the other downside of using peat in our soil block mixture is that it's really hard to moisten and to re-wet. So when we're watering our soil blocks, if they're made with peat, we have a really hard time getting them to moisten. So I'm going to sift this soil. This is key to using a potting soil as a soil blocking mix, is the sifting stuff. I have this big sifter. This is a big sifter. This is a 1/4 inch stainless steel strainer. It fits right into a 5-gallon bucket. You could also just make one of these using 1/4 inch mesh and some wood. Just make your own. But this one is nice because it fits in the bucket. So all I'm doing is I'm sifting my soil, and you can see what happens after I've sifted is I'm left with all these chunks. These are the chunks that I don't want in my soil block mix, because when I'm mixing my blocks, if one of these big old chunks gets into the mini soil blocker, it's gonna ruin the block. So hopefully that makes sense to you. Now I'm gonna go ahead and measure it out. This mix couldn't get any simpler, guys. If you haven't already watched our video where we tested these various soils, I tested mixing things in like coconut coir as a binder, and I found out that you really don't even need it. So let's just make this easier for everyone. Just use some sifted potting soil. It's all in getting the mix right with moisture. Now I'm gonna show the wool pellet process and the wool pellet block making in a follow-up video. So if you want specifically to use the wool, then you'll wanna watch that video. But in this one, I'm just going to use the potting soil just for the sake of showing you how easy soil blocking can be. But again, we do use the wool just because they have a nice slow release nitrogen in them. And for things that need to grow for longer, for example, our lisianthus, they really appreciate that slow release nitrogen. And that means I don't have to fertilize my seedlings. That's the other benefit of using a potting soil. We don't have to fertilize them nearly as often as we would, for example, seed starting soil, which has very little nutrients in it and is mostly peat based. All right, so I have measured some scoops into my bin. Now the bin that you want to use is not going to be too big. You don't want to put too much soil in here to start either, because if you add in too much soil, it's hard to get pressure down into the bottom using your blocker. We'll go through that in a second. Next, I'm going to add my water. If you are not going to use the wool, the next thing that I found is helpful is adding in a mycorrhiza. So a mycorrhiza basically forms an association with the plant root, and it helps the plants to get better access to the nutrients and the water that are available in your potting soil. So I did some tests, and interestingly, I did find that the mycorrhiza in the mix did help, especially when we were looking at that or wool pellets. Having the mycorrhiza almost looked as good as the ones with the wool pellets, and it's a little bit more affordable and more accessible. So the ratio is 1 teaspoon per 1 quart of your soil mixture. Now, any high quality mycorrhiza will work. This one is from Dr. Earth. And I'm just gonna eyeball it just because I kind of have an idea of how much I've used before. And then you're gonna wanna mix your dry ingredients together. You'll need a spatula. I just use an old paint scraper. It works great. So I'm gonna mix my dry ingredients together first. Just like a cake, you wanna make sure everything is incorporated, so you mix the dry first. And then I'm gonna add in my water. It's best to use warm water, but not hot. You don't wanna kill all your mycorrhiza, but warm water is gonna help it. I know that this water looked like it had soil in it. That's just because it was dirty from me washing my hands. It actually is just dirty, but it is water. All right, so let's see. That was 1 part water. Let's see how that looks. Not wet enough, so let's add a little more. And then I'll show you exactly the consistency that we're going for. You'll also want to reserve a little bit of your dry ingredients. So I still have some of my sifted dry potting soil over here, because as I press out the blocks, the mix gets progressively wetter. So being able to add in some dry as we go is helpful. So don't put in all of your dry ingredients at the beginning, reserve some for later. If you are used to starting in seed trays, this is going to look too wet to you, and it needs to be. So for soil blocking, we actually want our mix to be wetter. This is the first mistake I usually see people make, is not having their block mixture wet enough. So you want it to be like a risotto. You know when you're making risotto and you pull your spoon across, you want the water to kind of slowly trickle back in, but you want to be able to make a path with your spoon. So that's what's happening here. You can see I can make a path and a little bit of water trickles across, but it's not soaking wet on the bottom. We've got some glistening happening, and that's good. Okay, so now I've got this well mixed. I'm gonna go ahead and press out my first block. So I'm gonna start with the mini blocker, and I'm gonna grab my tray. I'm using these fiberglass trays. These are made in the US. They are very, very strong. So I can pick up a whole load of soil with this on there, and it doesn't flex and bend. I can hold it in one hand. This is why I like to use the fiberglass, not plastic. These are also gonna last 50 plus years. These are really gonna hang in there over the long haul versus a plastic one. So this is an 8x10. I have it linked in my Amazon shop below. Totally understand if you don't want to support Amazon, you can also get them from a website called Webstaurant, and you can get them in bulk from there. And this is the other size that we use. This is a 9x26, and this is the one that we use when we are starting a lot of seeds. So mostly this is what I use here on the farm. But if you're a home gardener and you're only starting a few seeds at a time, you can grab the fiberglass, or you can just save some old styrofoam meat trays after you've cleaned them from holding your ground beef or your chicken or whatever it is. And what I'm doing is I'm pressing down and wiggling as I go. Lift up, scrape off, and then repeat. Press down, wiggle, lift. And then I go to my tray, and you want to make sure that you have a nice flat bottom here. So really scrape it off. If you have any mounding happening on the middle of this blocker, it's going to mess up the way your soil blocks sit on your tray. So there we go, and I'm just going to pull up and release. So now you see we have nice little 20 blocker. And now let's make the next size up that we're going to pot these up into if we need to pot up. It also helps to keep your soil blocker clean. If you feel like it's not pressing out good blocks, give it a little rinse and some water. So now we'll use the big size, and you see I have my inserts in here. So these are going to be the same size as one of these little blocks I just made. Now when I'm making these bigger ones, I scoop all my soil to one side, and then I'm going to grab my blocker, pull toward myself, press down, and wiggle. Do it again. Now a scrape, just to level off the bottom, and then I'll repeat that one more time. Pull toward myself, press down, wiggle. Scrape off the bottom. Now, when it's time to pot up, you can see how these little guys are going to fit right into these. So usually I'll make a little, push down a little bit into that hole just to make them sit flush. Drop in that one, and then you have your potting up. So potting up is really, really easy with these, but again, if you don't have to do it, I honestly wouldn't. So yeah, if you're starting a lot of seeds, it's a great and fast way to pot up and to save space on your heat mats. But really for most people, I recommend the medium soil blocker. So, and just because these are so much easier to press out. So let's just do one quickly here with the medium. Give it a good stir in between each press. So every time you press out a block, it can be helpful to kind of give it a quick stir just to get the water back in there. Pull toward myself, press down and wiggle. Again, pull toward myself, press down, give it a scrape. Do it again. At the beginning, you're going to be a little bit slower at this, and that's okay. It's normal. Press down and wiggle. Scrape. Get the bottom nice and flat. And you can see on the 8x10 tray, this fits pretty well with room around the outside for watering, which we're going to talk about next. All right, so I'm just going to press down and lift. that one really needs some grease. You can tell which one I use the most. So these ones now have their little dibble in there where you can go ahead and start your seeds. I don't use vermiculite anymore. I just go ahead and use the same soil that I just sifted. So if I'm gonna plant a seed into my dibble and it needs to be covered, I'll just pop it right in, sprinkle it with a little soil, and then moisten that topsoil with the sprayer. What about humidity domes? I can already hear you asking me this from behind the screen. What do you use for a humidity dome? Well, you have a couple choices. You can use saran wrap. Obviously it's plastic. So, if you're reusing the same piece of saran wrap for multiple different seeds, I think that's okay, but I've actually started using something else. Some people will also use foil. Foil might be a better option just because foil is recyclable aluminum versus plastic obviously is not. And yes, I know what you're saying. Plastic is recyclable. The plastic recycling process is really, really horrendous. It releases a lot of microplastics into the soil. The recycled plastic that comes out at the end is highly toxic. So if you're looking at recycled seed trays, I would use caution and do your research on recycled plastic leaching. To me, I don't want moist soil sitting under lights or in the sun and potentially leaching that stuff into the soil. It's just, anyway, I guess I'm just paranoid because I trust no one. So what do I use as humidity domes anymore? You might recognize these. These are beeswax wraps. So we just take fabric, cotton fabric. I cut them with a pinking shear so you can see the edge doesn't fray when you cut it with a pinking shear, and then we sprinkle it over the top with some beeswax pastilles. I put it on a cookie sheet into the oven at about 225 degrees and until those melt. And then you have a waterproof humidity dome. So once I have my whole tray made here, I just lay my humidity dome right over the top, and you can make these any size, right? So if you're cutting fabric, cut them to the size of your tray and you have a custom humidity dome. So that way we are just putting these in here, no plastic needed. Now what about watering? Don't they fall apart when you water them? So when they are young like this and still pretty moist and they don't have plant roots in them yet, they are susceptible to falling apart if you top water. So if we're watering from the top with a watering can on top of these, then yes, they will fall apart. But once we get roots into these, the roots are really holding these together. Then you can top water them if you want. But just while they're young and starting out, we want to bottom water. So let me show you how we do that. So here I have a tray of ones that I let die. This was from our seed starting experiment. And I did feed all these radishes to the sheep, and then the zinnias just died because I stopped watering them. But what I want to show you is the fact that these soil blocks have roots in them. So you can see that there's roots in them holding them into place. So once they're like this, then I can top water and they're not going to fall apart. They really hold their own structure because those roots are there holding them in place. But until that point, we want to bottom water. So a can with a long neck and a narrow mouth, and we're going to just go right next to the blocks around the bottom, and they're going to wick it up. And they're going to wick up that water. And what I love about this is I always have trouble when I'm growing in a seed tray, seeing if they're too wet or they're too dry or whatever it is. It's hard to tell because they're encased in plastic. When they're exposed like this, it's really easy to tell when they're too dry or when they're still moist, and you don't have to water them. You can just look at them and tell by the color if they need water. So I've gone ahead and watered these ones, even though they were actually pretty well watered. And so now you can see that they're nice and moist. If you overwater, it's really easy with these trays. You just pour it out. So these nice firm trays, I'm just gonna tip. And there you go. The other thing that I get asked is, what about them growing together and how do you transplant these? So let's take a look at that. So yes, they will start to grow together, especially on these trays because they have a flat bottom. They just kind of start to grow into each other. It's still okay though. It's not a big deal. All you have to do is wet them. So when you're transplanting, before you're ready to plant out, obviously you're going to want to harden these off outside just like any other seed. And here's the little inside tip. When I'm hardening off, I also make sure that there's water in the bottom. And that way, in case they dry out in the sun or in the wind, there's a little reservoir. Sometimes they tend to dry out during that hardening off process. So if that's the case, just give them a little bit of extra before you put them out in the sun. All right, but let's say it's transplant time and I go to pick up my seeds. Oh my goodness, all of these are being held together by their root system. Don't panic, it happens. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna actually just grab them and gently pull them apart. So this is why we want to water them first, because if we try to do this when they're dry, they're probably going to crumble. So I'm going to gently grab and pull. And you can see how the roots just come apart. They're still on, they're still attached, they're just dangling. So I'm just gonna plant this directly into the ground. And usually I'll give it a little dip first in a little bit of compost tea. Boop, just a little dip like that. That way we've got some nice mycorrhizas, some nice microbial life right there around the rhizosphere, the root area of the plant. And then I plant that right into the soil. So much less transplant shock with these. I just really can't overestimate how lovely and easy planting these is compared to planting out of a tray. It's just so much easier. The other benefit is these trays can go in the dishwasher. So when we're talking about sanitizing and washing trays, they're just so much easier. All right, guys, that's it for today. I hope this is a helpful lesson and instructional on how to soil block and our new and updated easy recipe. It really couldn't be simpler. It's just that Coco Loco and a little mycorrhiza. Just go for a high quality mycorrhiza, and you're looking at about a teaspoon per quart of your seed starting soil. If you can't find Coco Loco, don't worry about it. Just find a good high quality, ideally OMRI certified potting soil and start from there. I hope you feel empowered to start soil blocking, and stay tuned. We are going to have our wool pellet recipe coming out tomorrow. So if you want to learn more about using those wool pellets, tune in for that. All right, guys, we'll see you guys around here next time at the farm. I'm gonna go dry off and warm up. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Really appreciate it. You guys mean so much. Thank you for being here. We'll see you around here next time.